Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Charles Warren.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it, Adam. So yeah, today I'm just going to kind of talk briefly about two different topics. One is just kind of an oversight of cybersecurity in this industry and what are some of the positions or different facets that exist within it, because it's difficult for those that are going into cybersecurity to just say, all right, I have a master's in cybersecurity or I have an undergraduate in cybersecurity. Now, what jobs do I apply for? So I'm hoping that I can go ahead and remove a little bit of the ambiguity surrounding that, and then focus a little bit inside of the expertise that I have and go into one of the niches that's in cybersecurity and talk a little bit about security automation. So I'm going to go ahead and host participant disabled screen sharing.
I think it does that automatically.
It's all good.
Advanced sharing options, all participants. All right,
okay,
give
cool.
it a go.
Now we're good. All right, sweet. So it seems I've been able to come up with the most condescending slide title possible, which was what I was going for. So this is Professional Insight to Cybersecurity by Charles Warren. All right, so why is this conversation necessary? Again, there are many different disciplines that have this kind of niche focuses within them. Take, for example, if you're going into design engineering or something, there are a million different avenues that you could take. You know, you could go into automotive, you could go into, I don't know, like submarine assembly, like just about anything that you want, right? Because again, when you're going for a degree that has a lot of different applications, it can be difficult to figure out what exactly you want to do. You're not going to find, or rarely going to find, on LinkedIn, security professional needed as a job posting. That's unfortunately, it'd be great if that was it, but it'd be so vague that you would have no idea what the applicants would have as their qualifications. So some of the different niches within cybersecurity, I kind of broke it up into these four like parents. So the first one is offensive security, and these are at least the three that I see this as. And offensive security may be a little bit wrong in the title for it. I think that definitely penetration tester and reverse malware engineer kind of fall with underneath that offensive sec branch. The other part of this is most of these positions would be very consultative in nature. So if we're talking about a penetration tester, they're generally coming from the outside and performing some type of audit on a system, whether it be specifically for software or it be an industry or a specific entity's infrastructure as a whole. Again, something like reverse malware engineer, there are resident reverse malware engineers at a lot of places like Sophos, Palo Alto. Norton has a really good center for reverse engineering. So a lot of the antivirus and EDR developers have their own internal resident malware engineers. But again, a lot of these people could be consulted out to as well for specific tasks. And then the other one is kind of another consultative position, which is auditing. So a lot of people don't really think about auditors as being cybersecurity related at first, but if we look at the industry and how many different information security initiatives there are globally, like GDPR or CCPA. So the GDPR is the General Data Protection regulations that are pertinent to the European Union. So if somebody wants to do business within the European Union, they have to be able to claim that they are GDPR compliant. To be able to make that claim, generally you'd have someone come from the outside of your organization, like a third-party auditor, and then they would go through your systems and make sure that you have the proper requirements in place to be able to meet that regulation. That way you can have a little badge on your website or whatever. But there's at least to my knowledge, tens, if not hundreds of these different certificates that businesses can get from lots of different entities. One of the more common ones right now is SOC 2 compliance. You'll hear people talk about, and there's, a billion auditors out there, it feels like, especially like on LinkedIn, they're trying to offer their services cheaply to go ahead and get you to be SOC 2 compliant. So definitely something to keep in mind. For anybody that's kind of more of down that kind of legalistic path, someone who's really interested in public policy. I think that there's definitely a need for auditors in this area, especially good ones. Definitely within health informatics, there's a lot of requirements and regulations for high tech and HIPAA that are a beast to navigate. So some of those do require a good hand. Another kind of facet within this information security chain that I have is the security governance and risk management portion. So within here, you'll kind of see the people that actually write policy. Generally, these are abstracted away from people that are implementing technology and following the policy. So you'll see people that are performing security policy specialist jobs where they are drafting the information security policies for certain entities. Again, they have to be fairly aware of the legal ramifications of their actions online as well. So these folks need to be able to comply with the audits. So when an auditor comes in and says you are subject to these different regulations, ideally the policy specialist will have already known about this and put something into place. And if an auditor comes in and says you are not meeting X regulation, the policy specialists would be in charge of drafting internal policy that would help them reach that regulation. So a lot of the security governance and risk management portion of cybersecurity is focused on trying to make business objectives meet kind of cyber awareness. So trying to figure out, all right, the financial risk officer says if we lose X amount of money in assets, we're going to be in trouble, right? That is a very general statement for someone to make, and probably something that somebody in this position has heard plenty of times. So it is their job to protect the assets, their job being likely the chief security officer. So the chief information security officer, the CISO, has to figure out, all right, I need to make sure that our intellectual property is not stolen. That's a directive that corresponds with the business. Now the information security officer will go ahead and make the policy or have somebody help them draft the policy that tries to make it more difficult for someone to be able to exfiltrate their intellectual property. So that's kind of just an example within it. But these policies can extend from mobile device compliance within an organization to how are we going to perform threat and vulnerability management within our infrastructure. So this could be, hey, we have to use X vendors. We have a contract with Nessus, we're going to use them. And then these are the different facets that we need to be scanning for. So these policies can be, I've seen almost 100 pages in length at some places that I've worked for their general information security policies. And they can be very in-depth and have different facets within them. So there's, for people that, again, are kind of that more legalistic mindset that really enjoy coming up with, unique ways to enforce cybersecurity. I think it's probably a good avenue to explore. And then the other piece within this is a risk analyst. So again, somebody that may not traditionally fall underneath that cybersecurity scope, but they definitely need to be aware of the impacts of cyber within their job. So anybody who's kind of working within the financial sector and has some type of associated risk generally has a group of risk management and folks, and those people within risk management have to be aware of the implications for information security. All right, so kind of enough of the stuff that I'm not super familiar with outside of just kind of experience transitive to talking with people and being a little bit involved there. But the pieces that I'm the most familiar with is the security engineering and architecture kind of area. So this is where we get network security engineers. So network security engineers are going to be focused mostly on providing a lot of the support with the network folks. Anybody who is involved in ingress or egress of data for an organization generally would be involved with the network security team. So they're going to be doing a lot of the firewall management. I've seen, again, because availability comes up as being a decent bit of information security, that generally network security engineers can kind of be intermingled with regular network engineers, and they can work on, load balancers, forward and reverse proxies. Again, if we talk about from a data loss kind of perspective, generally a network security engineer would be familiar with some of the data loss prevention tactics. So there's a lot of different things we can do with information tagging for data loss prevention, and how is that respected by different networking devices. Another one that we're going to talk about a little bit later on is security automation engineering. Again, this is a lot of scripting and programming related to the area of automation. It's pretty basic as far as from a description goes, I know. I guess if I had to come up with like a sentence to tie it kind of all together, generally the purpose of security automation engineers is to try to make a security operations center move as smoothly as possible. So we're trying to reduce the number of analysts that we need to be able to triage the same amount of cases. And that's not like just trying to replace people's jobs, but trying to get rid of busy work and make sure that the stuff that they're doing is actually meaningful and that they're not just getting stuck on something that could be, again, easily automated. A security operations engineer, these are the people that generally are going to be standing up like the actual security incident and event management engines. So standing up like a SIM, coming up with a lot of the solutions for data loss prevention, coming up with a lot of the solutions for, just about anything in here. I again, for those that are familiar with how advanced some of these systems can be, they definitely need engineers to maintain them. For example, at one of my previous places, they had like 4 engineers that were just on their threat and vulnerability management interface. So they were using, I think Nexpose was what they were using at the time, which is developed by the folks at Rapid7, I believe, the same ones that make Metasploit. And there's again like 4 engineers that were just in charge of maintaining that piece of infrastructure, and that would kind of fall underneath that security operations engineer. So generally the same as like a systems or network engineer, but specifically responsible for those tasks, and they need to be aware of the implications of what happens when that infrastructure goes down. And then lastly within here is kind of the application security software engineers. So people that are more in the CS focus, but are interested in cybersecurity. This is kind of a cool area to work within. There's lots of different facets for it. You can be more involved in kind of the application pen testing portion, where you're trying to develop part of your test suite that, takes kind of a dynamic as well as static security analysis approach. So some of it is kind of monotonous, especially when it comes to the static stuff. But it can be pretty fun to take like a black box perspective on your software and try to automate some of that and see what you can do from a content delivery standpoint. So part of that CI/CD pipeline that you have, having part of that test suite portion be security analysis is definitely a pivotal portion that people are trying to move to. And then, moving on to security analysis and digital forensics. Apologies for this slide is really long-winded. I'm realizing that it is now. So a security operations center is a entity that is devoted to maintaining all active incidents related to security intrusions. I think that's good. I'm not going to make it a list. I think that's good. So the general gist of it is an analyst within this space is going to be going through the cases that come in from your some type of incident management system. And then they're going to be triaging those cases as they need to. So there will be different levels of them. Like a tier 1 analyst would just see, a mass influx of cases come into them every day. Everything from phishing to malware being detected, to even something as odd as like a copyright infringement case. At some of the SOCs that I've worked at, they've been in charge of handling those copyright infringement and then forwarding them on to the proper people inside of the governance and risk management team. So again, lots of different things you're going to see inside of a SOC. But the general gist is that the SOC analyst is not going to be the one who will deal with it past where it's been identified as a true positive. So an analyst generally goes through, kind of works the case, and let's say, for example, of like a phishing case. So let's say that there's a phishing campaign going on that's targeting our industry. Let's say that I'm in banking today. They're specifically targeting our company, and they pretended to be our CEO. They sent out an email that was like, hey, everybody gets a free Grubhub $20 credit. And we had 3 people reported as phishing, and 2 of them clicked on it. So it would be the analyst's job to kind of group all of those incidents together and kind of make one cohesive story. And then as far as for the two people that actually clicked on it, that would be the job of the DFIR specialist. So that's like the digital forensics and investigation response, or active response, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as. And these people will be involved in quarantining the hosts, taking proper record of the state of the host at the time, grabbing any evidence that they need as far as for providing to any regulatory entity. Again, if there's something like a data breach, they'll have to report it to the regulating entities for GDPR, or if they're in California for the CCPA. So lots of stuff that they need to be aware of. And then again, there's kind of a more managerial position within here, the SOC manager, who tries to bridge that handoff and kind of maintains both sides of the house. All right, that's a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions thus far that I can answer?
Looks like no questions from us so far.
All right, that's impressive. Cool. So the niche that I'm responsible for and have been for a little bit of time now is kind of in this security automation engineer as well as the security operations house. So what is security automation specifically? The idea that automation via programming can improve the capacity and capability of any given security operations center. So the four basic metrics that we're trying to minimize are the mean time to response, so how fast analysts can get on a case; the mean time to resolution, so how fast after an analyst has got on a case can we get them to close the case or identify it as being a true or false positive and move on to the next one. The time that's spent on false positives. This is a really important one that is difficult for SOCs to automate by themselves, and is a lot of the reason why larger companies like Palo Alto are contracted by these entities is again trying to figure out via either machine learning or just following their analysts for a lot of hours and trying to kind of piece out what makes a false positive and how do we just push that away so an analyst doesn't even see it. So there's a lot of emphasis right now in false positive management, and one of those pieces is machine learning. And then again, the number of false negatives is another very important portion. A SOC manager would likely argue that this is the most important metric. And the reason for that being, what happens if somebody does install something like a rootkit on one of our nodes and we mark that as a false negative? You know, again, now somebody has a backdoor into our environment and we're not going to be checking it until something else comes up later. So in a SOC, false negatives are pretty hard to come by. Maybe that's because really there's no accountability measure for it. Oh, that's cool. Could that not do that? That's a fun feature. I appreciate that. Okay, so yeah, again, false negative is something that we definitely don't want to have. Very bad implication of it. So what are some of the steps that we take when trying to automate an incident? Well, the first thing that we need to do is have an incident in the first place. So within the security engineering kind of area, right, I talked about automation engineers. What are the platforms that they work on? Generally, it's called a security orchestration and automated response tool, or SOAR. So the tool that I worked on when I was at Palo Alto for the last year was XSOAR. So within XSOAR, I worked with the state of North Dakota, and these were kind of the top to bottom steps that we were taking in every incident, just generally. So if you end up working with the tool in the future, some of this might make sense. I can't just show the tool, unfortunately, because I don't really have access to that, nor should I be presenting that. So I'm just going to kind of give a brief aside about where this is in the industry right now and what is it doing. So the steps that are taken, the first part is to get an incident in the first place. Again, in the incident of something like a phishing use case, you would generally have in your mail client like a forwarding address that would go to a mailbox that was used for phishing. So that's going to be read by our SOAR, and our SOAR is going to take that and ingest one incident for each reported phishing case. Another one could be a SIM query. So let's say we're using something like Elasticsearch as our SIM, and we want to find every time a host gets locked or an account gets locked out of Active Directory. Now, this might be a really noisy alert. So that's why we would have our SOAR handle it and not just have an analyst kind of perusing through it, because we're going to want to try to identify as many of these false positives as possible. But if we can have a query within Elastic that says, hey, I'm looking for event ID X in Windows land that corresponds with a locked out account. And I want all of those instances to create a new incident. That would be an example of using like a SIM query. Some of these additionally, if you don't want to use email, you could use like a webhook. If we have a specific incident, let's say we have some type of API exposed from our SOAR, and we want an analyst to be able to just manually create an incident. If they do something like put a note in Slack so they can go back and do it later, would be an example of using a webhook. Again, lots of different ways to be able to get data in there. So what do we do once we create an incident? Well, the general thing that we want to start with is enrichment. So the first thing that we're going to do when I get my incident is just think about it as just being this giant block of JSON. So it's just this mess of a dictionary, and there's going to be ingested pieces that came out cleanly, and sometimes there won't be. In the instance of an email, it's going to break everything up from the headers. It's going to have who is it to, who is it CC'd by, what all is there from the mail server. So it'll have all the email header magic. It will have the actual subject and the body. And then that's pretty much it for this. And then any attachments that are going to be there. So if we have that in our head, that what we're getting is just an email and there's nothing else magical going on, then everything else that happens magically needs to be done by us, the security automation engineers. So that means performing swaths of regex to try to pull out different indicators. So just a couple of indicators of compromise, and their types would be, we would want to look for IP addresses associated with it. We would want to look for file hashes. We would want to look for domain names and URLs. Those are like 4 good ones that are pretty universal across every use case. So once we performed our regex and extracted those specific indicators of compromise, we would go ahead and perform some type of threat intel query using, there's a handful of different online APIs for this. You could use something like Alien Vault is one that's free. Palo Alto has their own autofocus that they use. There's a handful of other ones that you can find out there. And what we would do then is for each one of those IOCs, we would get the associated reputation. And if all of them came back benign, well, we would just say, all right, that's another tick that says that maybe this is going to be a false positive. If some of them came back as being malicious, specifically, some of them came back as being associated with a certain advanced persistent threat, an APT, like, we know that this is a Russian-funded, APT, and this is associated with one of their commonly used IP blocks for their, command and conquer machines. Then that would probably be a good indicator that it's not a false positive. That might also be an indicator to raise severity on the incident. So again, threat intel is an important thing to think about when we talk about security automation. Another thing would be trying to gather additional endpoint information. Within phishing, generally, you're not going to have a meaningful endpoint included. Any endpoint name is probably going to be your mail server. You're probably already going to know that as an analyst, so that one really doesn't matter here. But let's say user information. It does matter to establish the context of what privileges does a user have within inside of your environment. So let's say the difference between a Microsoft system administrator and the CEO. They have both privilege within an organization, but significantly different impact. So if we talk about a phishing campaign and the CEO was targeted, I'm probably going to raise my severity on that case pretty fast. If a CEO was targeted, it means that it was likely a type of spear phishing. The attacker knew what they were doing, and they were trying to get credentials to be able to, feign reputation without the rest of the organization. So that's a pretty important one. For a Microsoft System Administrator, again, they do have privileges within the organization, specifically within those servers that they manage. But the question is, right, was this a targeted attack? So maybe we put that to a medium severity rather than a high severity. And again, we have an analyst go through it and figure out what type of actions did the user take. Was there any activity that was abnormal from their baseline, and kind of have an analyst triage that and make sure that nobody actually had stolen credentials if that person did click on a link. Again, have them reset their password and follow whatever procedure they have. And an instance where endpoint information would be pertinent, though, think about if we have something like an EDR case. So an EDR is an endpoint detection response agent. You'll also hear them referred to now as XDR. It's kind of silly. It's just like an extended response, but I don't know why they're going down that route. So if for an EDR, you could have a handful of different types of alerts. But let's say that there's a specific alert that was triggered because of like a NOP sled or something. You've seen that there's some type of reverse malware engineering or some type of reverse engineering happening on this machine, not necessarily reverse malware engineering. So you see that there's some type of reverse engineering happening here. Maybe there's some type of malicious code that's been executed. We could also say if somebody tried to override like the little Windows thing that will show up, like the trusted platform or the trusted software engine that will say, hey, this is not signed software. And maybe your organization has specific policies on it and somebody overrides it anyway. And then we see some type of malicious activity happening through one of like the intrusion prevention modules within the EDR. That would be like an example of where, all right, let's figure out what type of endpoint this is. So the endpoint information that was retrieved from the EDR could be, okay, this is like an Active Directory server, or this is somebody's Chromebook. And again, if somebody is attacking a Chromebook, it likely has less of an impact immediately than if somebody has access to an Active Directory server. So that might be something to keep in mind for an analyst, and good information to provide an analyst. So that's kind of the gist of enrichment here. Another piece to talk about is the response. So response, this is where a lot of the shadowing of the SOC analyst comes in. You're going to want to work through with them on what exactly needs to happen based on their operating procedure. So let's say in the event of a compromised credential, what do? Do they contact the manager? Do they contact the person directly? Do they need to perform some type of additional investigation to go through their previous activity and kind of like audit them and make sure that somebody else did not actually have access to this account, even though we know that their credentials were compromised? So that could be an example of like a manual process that we would look to automate. So we could do some of that emailing and reach out. We could do some of that grabbing additional logs and trying to parse through them. So that's something that an automation engineer could handle. Another example, again, kind of covered it, the reach out to necessary contacts, pretty straightforward. One of the cooler ones that is a bit riskier, but you'll see some SOCs do it, is automated remote file detonation. So if, for example, let's go back to the phishing case. We know that somebody did install malware from a phish. If we were just to go ahead and say that if we had the egress firewall logs that said, hey, this user did in fact make a request to this URL associated with this phishing campaign, intending to download this, and then we looked for that file and then removed it from their actual machine using that the EDR. That would be like an example of kind of like a seek and destroy kind of objective. Another one that is I think a little bit less frowned upon, and there's a lot less around it, is just endpoint as isolation. So generally it's okay to isolate an endpoint. Again, if we detonate a file, you're not really getting it back. But if you isolate an endpoint because you think there's some type of malicious activity is going on, it's pretty easy to unisolate an endpoint. So that's one that you could see somebody doing as part of response. And then again, within this kind of response tree, after we've done this enrichment, likely more further up at the top, because we want to perform the least amount of actions on each case as we can if it's a false positive. You'd see some type of logic branch that kind of goes over and says, hey, this is a false positive. All right, any questions on kind of what I went over right there?
I do not see anybody with questions.
All right, sweet. That's awesome.
They're like sponges, just absorbing the information.
All right, I hope that this is not like too bad or anything. I hope that I'm not going like too in depth on anything. Again, if anybody has any questions, just let me know. So some of the examples of security automation that you generally see like right out the gate are the phishing and the EDR use cases one. So I kind of went into those again, top to bottom. What we're going to do with the phish. Again, this is some type of email that has been targeted to try to get some additional access within an organization. So for that, we're going to want to ingest it. We're going to want to take out the sender, try to figure out what the reputation of the sender is. There's plenty of threat intel that we can find on a specific email sender, like with, I think it's, so there's Abuse IPDB is like the IP equivalent. I'm trying to think, like Spam House. I think these guys have a good one. Spam House. So this is a really interesting project, and you can go ahead and look up specific emails here as well. So this one has, I think this is just an IP lookup. Oh no, you can do like a domain here. So let's say like if there was, they have a list. All right, cool. So all the way back then in 2010 is when this was first year. So yeah, they have the DBL, which is their specific domain block list. So you could go ahead and check this list and see if the mail sender had that domain that they were sending from, and it was inside of like an advisory list. Generally, we could identify that as being a malicious sender. That would probably be a good idea to escalate at that point. So maybe we want to increase our severity there. Again, for phishing, there's generally not a lot of automation that happens as far as for resolution. Most of it is from kind of identifying false positives, because there's a lot of false positives within phishing, and then kind of providing the analyst with the right tools when they need to go through that. For the EDR use case, you're going to see most of the automated resolution happen within the EDR use case. There's going to be not as much you can do with false positives, at least in my experience. Because again, some of these are more complicated alerts. If you have some alerts that are very sensitive and need to be tuned better, let's say, I'm trying to think about what I can talk about here. So within some of these different XDR utilities, they have like these behavioral threat analysis kind of tools that you can put together. So you can have like not just like a search for a specific indicator, but a search for a specific behavior pattern. So think about like heuristics from an EDR kind of perspective. So if we see some type of like admin abuse alert, it could be very, very vague. Generally, these types of alerts have a lot of false positives. So EDR use cases could be good for identifying false positives there. If we want to say, hey, if it is a system administrator and they're performing these actions regularly, maybe we want to just have like an exclusion list that says, I don't want to see alerts for this everywhere. And if for some reason your team is not doing a good job of filtering those out at the source, you could always filter them out kind of inside of the SOAR engine that you're using. So definitely an application there. I think I kind of went into every other facet of these. Yeah, I guess that's really what I have. Yeah, I guess now I'd like to open it up for questions and just kind of see if there's any gaps that I can fill as far as for what security automation is used for, or just kind of answer any questions that you guys have.
Does anybody have any questions right off the bat? I know I've got a kind of a random question for Charles. It's great.
I'm thinking.
Okay, we have some people that are thinking. So I've got a random
Sure.
question. Like when I've described to you, like, or described to other people what your position is, I've said that you work at, shoot, what was it, at Palo Alto? You're a security automation engineer, I believe. Are you affiliated with Michigan Tech still? Like, are you a grad student or a master's student or?
Yeah, I'm a grad student right now.
Okay,
Yep.
That's what I thought, but I wasn't
Yes.
sure.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then-
So I'm just finishing that up, and then actually I just left Palo Alto about 2 weeks ago now, and I'm actually working at Jump Trading as a tech and kind of SecOps engineer.
Okay.
But yeah, I still have a lot of friends at Palo Alto. If anybody's ever interested in getting a job there, I'm more than happy to get you in touch with some of the recruiting team. It's a great company.
Mia. Yeah.
So is Ansible then used to automate the XOR or are they two separate entities?
Could you hear that, Charles?
Was she asking about Ansible?
Yeah, is Ansible used to automate in security?
So does XOR use Ansible to automate?
Does XOR use Ansible to
Or
automate?
are they two separate?
Or are they just two
Okay.
unrelated things?
Sure. So that's actually a great question. XOR specifically has a content plugin for Ansible, and it's really extensive. What XOR uses is just a combination of a lot of predefined and then any scripts that you define yourself to be able to kind of orchestrate different tasks. So the short answer is no. It does not directly use Ansible in any way, but you can use Ansible additionally. The one that I've seen that I thought was really interesting is using it for trying to do some type of state management. So let's say that during like an EDR event, if we have we're going down this path and we say, all right, this host has been compromised beyond repair, and we just want to go ahead and reflash it. Essentially, you could go ahead and use Ansible to perform the original state management and kind of go back and reprovision the host essentially. So we reinstall whatever we need to. We look for the differences and then kind of go through that. So you could use something like Ansible or Salt for that. And I didn't get to directly work on any use cases like that while I was working with Palo Alto. But it's definitely something that I had heard other of our automation engineers working on at different points. So it's definitely a different technology in itself, but its state management definitely extends past what XOR could do by itself. So if you have any use cases where you would be using Ansible inside of your work originally, you could try to automate those within XOR to kick off those different playbooks that you're trying to run. If that makes sense.
Matt, are you ready to go with the question? Okay, no. Peter has one.
Are there any specific tools that you recommend we might want to look into for security automation?
Oh, definitely. So the immediately I stopped sharing my screen. That's not what I meant to do. So XOR is the one that I got to work on. That's specifically XOR. I didn't say that. So this one's pretty cool. And obviously I'm going to be a bit of a shill for this. This is, again, they do have a free version that you can get. It's very limited in its automation capability, which is the one thing that I will knock it on. So let me just go ahead and shoot you guys. Let's see, where do I get chat? I'll put this in the chat, and hopefully Adam can disseminate it additionally if he needs to. I'll put it in a DM to him. But yeah, feel free to check this out and ask me any questions that you have in regards to it. This is definitely something that's good to be familiar with. Yeah, I'm trying to think about what are some of the other things. Again, if you're interested in security automation, it's really good to be a little bit more than just familiar with scripting, but to be pretty competent in Python. That's definitely the language that is pretty prevalent across a lot of this. I've seen some platforms that use JavaScript in tandem with Python, but Python is definitely king. The other one of these that exists is Phantom. Did they like go out of business, or are they still automation? All right. Splunk bought them? Oh, all right. Well, that's cool. Okay. Sweet. So Splunk bought these guys out. These were originally their own entity. So you can check this one out too. I don't know how good the community edition is, but feel free to check out Phantom. This uses exclusively Python scripts to kind of define itself. So familiarity with Python in general is probably a good idea. Otherwise, I just recommend checking out these tools.
Peter's good to go. Anybody else with questions? And then I do have Charles's contact information. So if anybody does have questions in the future for Charles, I can, give each other his contact information. So, well, if no more questions, then that does it from us. Thank you very much, Charles, for presenting. It was a lot of detailed information that even went over my head because I don't know a lot about cybersecurity yet. But
yeah, I hope that I did not make it too pointed. And again, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I just wanted to kind of go into it a little bit, and that's why the first half of the presentation was kind of the way that it was, because I was hoping that this would at least open people's eyes to what are some of the potential possibilities here, and then kind of go into a little bit of the weeds of security automation, because it does get hairy pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes with security, it's security, but what does security actually mean? So it's another highly in-depth field. So
yeah. So I'd highly recommend that you guys check out some of those different SOAR platforms. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if you have any questions about grad school, you can also feel free to reach out. I'm just finished on my master's this semester, and then I'm going to start my PhD next. So if there's anything I can do to help out, just let me know.
all right, well, we really appreciate it.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, guys.
And then
All right.
for the other people on Zoom, I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting here. So unless there's any questions, nope. All righty.